Hello, this is Red Hawk. I'm coming to you from Spokane, Washington. I want to welcome you all to our podcast. My cohorts are Bob Hayes, who's in Florida, and Mary Ann. She's also in Washington State, but she's out in the valley. I'm up here on the hill. Our last podcast, Will We Make It? You know, it was kind of unsettling, and especially because so many of the great minds are in doubt whether we'll make it or not. And that was hard. So this week we're going to talk about our story. There is an emerging story. What are the elements? What are the essential pieces? For those of you who've been dancing with me and following our podcast, I like to see things in their essential pieces. And we've talked about that, you know, the whole way that things have emerged from being, life, to consciousness, through the essential processes of complexification, differentiation, and semi-permeability. It's a hell of a story, man, and we are it. We are the point where it's still becoming something new. Here we are. So what's our story as the human family? What do we need to survive ourselves? And I think that what we need is a story that is emerging. It's coming from all corridors, a story that allows all of us on this planet to have a place and a life that is full. And there is a story, our story, the Earth story, and we've talked about that through many of these podcasts from the very beginning of Big Bang, even before. And we're up to this place now that human beings are not just included, but we are the place where the story of it all has become aware of itself. As our story emerges, there are three essential elements that I see as necessary to the story. They have to be there in every way. It just has to be. And what those three aspects are reflect the very nature and the way of balance, and here's one of the essential aspects, process. You see, we have to, at some point, put ourselves in accord with nature, for we are her. So the three pieces: diversity, inclusion, and process. Whatever the story is, it has to reflect the rich, extravagant diversity that nature has presented. I've said often, the differences make the beauty. The sameness lets us share it. So let's get on board, man. We have a rich, rich place. And yet the human family, when I came to my church, there was a stained glass window that had been immortalized when the old church came down. And it was a stained glass with light behind it. And when you walked into the church, the first thing you saw was this, and it was a blonde Jesus. You know, those days of trying to make everything the same, to make it look like me, those are over. Those are over. The human story must become an analog for nature herself. We're an extension of her. We are her children, as I've said. And to survive, it's going to depend on a story that we all see ourselves a part of. Biodiversity, cultural diversity, religious diversity, individual diversity, diversity of jobs and skills, and et cetera, all of this over and over. Diversity is at the root of innovation, of growing perspective, of all kinds of different skills, and it also breeds acceptance. We've talked about a paradigm shift, and this is an integral piece of it. And I'm going to hazard to say that America and cities around the world, but America is the city, if you will, on a shining hill. It is struggling right now, especially, to somehow reflect this great diversity that is here. Now, there are some who want to make us all the same, and if you're not the same, then you're the enemy. And we see that whole idea rising in America, and it's sad because one of the greatest parties that this country has ever had has been taken over by those who want everything to be the same, and the sameness is defined by who they are. This is the antithesis of who America is and who the planet is struggling to become. A story that is inclusive, that reflects the diversity of nature, and that shows that it's a process. And we've talked about the three essential processes: diversification or differentiation, which is all over the place here. Complexification, that means things are getting complex, putting together and having children that look very different than the way their great-grandparents looked. And the whole concept of semi-permeability, which is where we learn to accept each other. And I have to say, my grandchild, we read to him, there are so many books now that are reflecting the diversity, that human beings are not all like who you see in the mirror, but who we are is great and rich and extravagant. And it's a wonderful thing. And this is the root of the human story that has to happen. Now, how do we become that? How do we do that? I think we're doing it. And it's a battle. It's full of conflict and reaction and all kinds of stuff. Welcome to the drama of history. So, our story. I just did my shotgun blast, and Marianne, I'll turn it over to you first. You just got back from New York City, which to me is one of the vortices of diversity and a place where all the differences and the inclusion and the processes seem to be at least bumbling together.
That is a very astute observation because 8 million people in New York City, that's a lot of people. And as you move through the crowds, and there are a lot of crowds, you hear a variety of languages, you see different modes of dress, you see people that look so different, and yet you meet their eyes and they're the same. And I think that, and we've talked about this in several podcasts, where we're all part of this nature. We're all part of nature. And so how do we fit in as human beings in this greater ecosystem that's the earth? And, we went to the Natural History Museum, and you talk about the biodiversity of nature and just the different species. As you walk through and you look at, there's just this wide range of so many different living creatures on this planet. And to think that human beings should all be the same, it just was like, what? We all work together and we all have something to share. We're all part of this. So, my mind is still really kind of on my trip. So it was, but one of the things, standing at, looking at the Statue of Liberty and the reason that was created, and America can be this place of this highest ideal, that it's a place where we all come together, and people do not have to have power and lords over each other. It was about freedom. It was about breaking the shackles, and it was about embracing each person that comes here, no matter what their background, no matter who they are, no matter how they look, and accepting them and bringing us all together.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the diversity, the inclusion, and the process, I think the diversity is there. The inclusion is something we have to work at, and process is ongoing.
Yeah. And we started as an ideal, and we still are. We're reaching right for a more perfect union. What is a more perfect union? And part of what I'm talking about today is just that. This is a more perfect union reflects these three essential processes, or three essential aspects of an emerging story. Bob, what say you?
Well, I agree with you. I think that America, the United States, has been a fundamental experiment in inclusion. but there's like everything else, there's opposing forces, and that they're working against each other and trying to come to a new kind of balance. Because even though we're bringing people from all over the world and trying to include them into the American society, there's still this tendency to cluster with people who are similar. You have Little Italy, you have Chinatown, you have the Old South, you have the Rust Belt. The people identify with these clusters of sameness, but at the same time, we can reach out across them. So, we used to talk about a melting pot. America was a melting pot. Well, I see it differently today. I see it more as a mosaic, where you have all of these clusters of different types of people, different cultures that can work together to form a larger picture that includes them all, but lets them keep their unique characteristics.
Yeah.
So again, it's that balance we're looking for.
Yeah, and I call that the difference between a soup metaphor versus a salad metaphor. There are a lot of ways to put your vegetables together. You can blend them all as one, or you can keep them separate and enjoy the richness there. And I think that both of those are valid. And I think it's also important to understand the elements of a story are a place to get, and what we're looking for is a place of that reflects the diversity, inclusion, and processes of nature. However, a story includes the challenge and the impediments to that. That's what makes a story. Every story has a beginning place and a place it wants to end, and in between are all these things that get in the way. And that's what creates the drama. And so the story that we need is one that shows the struggles that the human family is going through and nail those struggles as impediments. These are the things that get in the way, and they're real challenges. I think those are the real challenges.
Yeah. We've talked in several podcasts about science fiction and, the comic book movies and all of these kind of things and how that they are moving us toward that more inclusive view of the world, because we've got so many different types of heroes. There's just a new show just starting called Ms. Marvel, which has the first Muslim superhero, a young teenage girl, which has so many different implications. As a female representing the Muslims, has its own implications.
Yeah, and we're talking about the hero being redefined as not the white person in a white hat.
Exactly. And the struggles that she is going through as a Muslim American, trying to fit into the American dream and at the same time keep her parents happy and maintain their cultural integrity and so forth. So, again, these stories that we're beginning to tell all have a little piece of what you're getting at, the diversity, but yet the inclusion.
Yeah.
And the process is we have to keep trying and experiencing these new things until it becomes more natural.
That's right. And this is part of the emergent story that I'm talking about. These are little bits and pieces. Go ahead, Mary Ann.
Well, I was going to say, and you brought up some really good points. But I think that whole cultural piece, and when you see a place like Chinatown or Little Italy, and I think the whole idea of the melting pot, when people came here, it was understood that you learn the language, you start to assimilate, you live by a different set of customs and rules. And I think what's happening now is we're going, no, there's a wide variety of languages, there's a wide variety of customs, there's a wide variety, and all of those can have a place within a diverse culture. I think what we do is we try to tell everyone else that they need to be like us. And Brett Huck, you talked about this right in the very beginning. And I think what we're seeing now is this emergence of embracing these cultural differences and finding where we are the same in we love our children. We want to have a happy life. Those are the similarities that we need to bring out and bring together. We want freedom. We want to be able to earn a living. We want to be able to, there are basic human things that is completely across the board. And I think that's where this process is, that you don't have to give up these rich, beautiful cultures. You don't have to give up a rich, beautiful language. Language helps you see the world in a whole different way. And the more languages we can learn, I was talking to somebody, and I'd never heard this before, but they said what they were taught was the more languages you know, the more soul you have, the more spirit you have. And it's because it's a different way of being able to understand and see the world. And I think that, but when we get to that whole blending, it's those same basic instincts that we all have, regardless of all of that.
And what we've laid out here is that there are diverse views of diversity. So that, and I love Bob's mosaic. I think that's the distinctions remain. And yet, if you back up, you see that those distinctions fit a bigger pattern that allows us to be richer, to see the extravagant nature. And this is what I think the human family has to understand, is although there is of course, some resistance and change that is needed within one's heart to embrace things that are different, we become richer. And what you just said about languages, I think that the different languages, you look at reality from a slightly different point of view. When I learned that languages had sex, that there were female words and male words, that was like, what? How can they do this? And, it was great. It was like a vista opened up of my understanding of something deeper going on in language than I was seeing. And I think over and over, this is part of the story, to show that all the resistances to diversity are probably necessary. At the same time, it is important that they're necessary only to further understand the diversity at a deeper level, because they ask certain questions that I think do need to be addressed. And many of those questions are around fear and change. But I want us to see that in this story that's emerging, it's trying to embrace these differences. And I love Bob's example of Ms. Marvel. But not just that. I think of the first Star Wars where he walked into the bar. That was a revolution in my mind. Like, oh, wow, this is a whole different way of seeing it. And I'd already been 200-300 sci-fi books under my belt at that point. So that was, the visual of that was good.
What's happening there in the bar, and this is the perfect intro to a thought that I wanted to articulate, and that is that when we have this diversity, we can embrace it by finding something we can share. In the case of Star Wars that you just talked about, they shared the experience of being in a bar together. And you had all of these weird-looking people, but they were all there having a drink, listening to the music, and sharing that experience. I think one of the things in my own experience that has helped me reach out to diverse cultures is the sharing of food. We all have to eat, but you can go to an Afghani restaurant and experience tastes that you haven't had before that you could still enjoy. You can go to an Indian restaurant. You can go to, you tick them all off. But when we go there to share food, we're sharing a universal experience. We all have to eat, and we can all enjoy the taste of good food. And through that shared experience, we can examine and enjoy diverse approaches.
And what we can begin to do is see that this diversity is everywhere. It's in the palate, it's in the nose, It's in the touch. I mean, one of my grandkids' books, he doesn't go to it so much. It had this whole thing where it had fur, it had scales, and you touched it, and you saw the differences in touch and fabric and texture. And all of these things add up to the most unique experience in the whole universe, and that's you. It's happening. The neurology in your head is the pinnacle, as far as we know, of everything that's happened. This is it. This is the place that's still emerging. And we're in a both a wonderful and a scary place, because there's nobody coming in to save us. We have to somehow work this out ourselves. And I think we are. I do believe that the challenges are great, and the existential aspect of it is looming. However, welcome to a good story. Every good story, and so many stories today are apocalyptic. Either a Finch, which is after the apocalypse, or before the apocalypse, which is, we got to save the day from the Russians or the Chinese or whatever. Over and over, this is the human story. And I love going through Amazon and Netflix and Disney and Apple Plus, and kind of just looking for those stories that are trying to pitch us into something new. Bob, you talked about Night Sky. I turned Bob on to Night Sky. The emotional content within that story shows, the differences make the beauty. The sameness lets us share it. The sameness of trying to share a most unique experience that is so different that it blows your mind at first engagement. And I think that's part of what stories are supposed to do. They're supposed to take us into the next step, the next iteration, and explore it, that we might taste it before we gobble it up. One of the things I said is a story is the currency of meaning in the human family. It's where we put our deeper values, our treasures, and you can see those in our stories. So one of the things I'd like to say to our listeners, sharpen your eye and your ear and look for those stories that are on the growing edge of the human mindscape. There's stuff happening on the horizon there that is just amazing.
Well, and I think going back to the idea of story and diversity, and, a lot of the stories that are unfolding and are happening are ancient stories. You go back to the Greek myths, we're still telling the same stories. Human condition we're still going through all of these same plays that we've been playing out throughout history. But I think you said something, Red Hawk, about the resistance to diversity and what jams that up. And I think when we're confronted with something different, our insecurities kick in and our fear kicks in that, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not doing this as well as I thought I was, or maybe what I was taught was incorrect. And so then people will, out of fear, dig in and I would like to express that if we can just get past that first insecure thought and examine it, that can lead us down to a whole different way of being in the world. Because when we understand that just because someone's different doesn't make our way wrong, and it doesn't make their way wrong or right. It's just a matter of the same story being expressed in a completely different way within each one of us. And that's where we come back to what's the uniqueness of each human being, and how do we, we're all taking in the same external stimulus, but we're processing it in our own way. And what we're bringing back into the world is diversity. We're bringing, if we're allowed to, a lot of us are constrained and are feel like we have to conform, and that conformity is soul killing.
Yeah.
And so when we can just be who we are and express that into the world, then we're living the same story over and over again.
Well, and we are living the same story over and over again, and every story has the same elements. And we are now caught up with our plot point for the human story. We haven't gotten to the second plot point yet. That's where everything turns around in a whole different way. And Mary Ann, you put something on there that's very important in the story, and that's acceptance. Because the fact is, nobody, and Bob, you said this a lot, nobody's like who I am. When you really get down to all the idiosyncrasies, I am an individual and totally unique. And we have to be able to find, not just artists, but everybody, find a deep value in their uniqueness and a deep value in accepting another person's uniqueness. Because once we do that, we see how rich we are. Once we see that, oh my gosh, there was a movie, it was all black and white, and as people woke up, it became color. I think it's like that. We're walking around where we think all the flowers are the same flower. And we're waking up that the garden is full and rich, and we're cataloging the whole thing. I mean, talk about an archive. Every flower, every frog, every worm, every mosquito, all the differences are being cataloged, and we're seeing that you get rid of the mosquito, you get rid of a lot of birds. However, if you breed a mosquito that actually has an antidote to malaria, then when the mosquito bites you, the mosquito, you might scoot it away, but you're actually being inoculated against the very thing that other mosquitoes brought into the first place. And there are 3 universities working on that. It's an amazing thing. We are now learning to dance with the diversity of nature and reflect it at finer and finer levels. We now have to find a story that includes all of that allows the diversity, inclusion, the processes, the acceptance, all of that to happen. And realize in the story that some of the main challenges that are going to get in our way, that are going to make the story, are insecurities and fears. So we need to make those explicit. We need to help people understand, oh my gosh, I'm feeling insecure. And I'm feeling insecure because I learned something different than what I'm seeing. Believe me, I'm a Southerner. I'm reading the story of Robert E. Lee, the latest one, as penance because of all the stuff I have to unown in myself that I learned as a child about slavery, about the culture I was raised in, about the Civil War. It hurts like hell. It really hurts to own that stuff. But I want you to also know it's also liberating. It's liberating. Remember, I was the kid who the neighbors called the parrots on at 8 a.m. because I was running around blowing a bugle and carrying a Confederate flag, running around, trying to gather the troops to fight that day's war and kill the Yankees. I've come a long way on that front.
That's a good thing. I'm glad you've come along with me on that.
Go ahead, Bob.
Let me push back just a little bit, because I'm always trying to come back to that concept of balance. Diversity is a good thing, but all differences are not good. All cultures are not equally good. We have to be able to find these universal values we've talked about them as values, as roadmaps, as whatever. We can look at other cultures, but we have to be willing to understand that everything about that other culture is not something we want to embrace.
And those cultures will look at us and they'll say the same thing about our culture.
Exactly. But there's no way that you can tell me that putting a woman in a head-to-toe burqa is a good thing. Now, that's a cultural law in a lot of countries, but it's not something that I personally am willing to accept as being equally good as a woman being free to dress as she wishes.
And now we're talking about inclusion, and we gotta wrap this up because we're at the end of our time. But I think that inclusion piece is integral to what you're saying, Bob, in terms of the story.
Yeah, and finding those higher values that allow us to include.
And believe me, the East has some of those higher values, but we'll talk about that in another episode.
They do.
Okay, Bob, final comments?
Well, I think I've pretty much said it. We want to include. We want to include what's good. We want to build that mosaic to be the most amazing picture that it can be, and we do that by both accepting our internal differences and our shared values, and we hope we can use whatever means we can in storytelling and passing on values to our children and so forth that's going to allow us to do that.
Amen. Marianne, final comments? Sorry to we got going and it's like,
It was like, I want to say something about that, but I'll let it go.
Well, anyway, include it in your final comment, seriously.
I will. Well, it's all around who determines what is good, right? And so you have these cultures that have these traditions that have been around forever, and the people within it, some of them embrace that. And I think the danger is when we, as outside of that culture, try to say that is not good. You need to stop that, rather than saying, I would never want that for myself, and so you do you and I'll do me, kind of thing. Well, as long as we're not hurting each other. And that's where that shared piece comes in. When we were talking about the diversity, so I'm going to kind of reference my recent experience with cab drivers in New York City. So we took many cabs, and each one of those cab drivers did their job. They got us to our destination, but each ride was so unique. Some of them, it was like, I will never do that again. And another one was, wow, this could have been a very dangerous situation. Another one where it was like, oh my God, this guy could be my best friend, right? And so it was like, that's that whole, talking about the good and bad, one of them was not good for us. And I would like I said, it was kind of a scary situation. Another one of it was like, oh my gosh, let's go have tea somewhere. And the other one was, I really thought we were going to die. It was very frightening. So I think that the whole, it's complex, and yet it's simple. It comes down to, what do we share as human beings? And that we need to be able to include those things that are, and we've talked about this before, the life enhancing versus the life taking away. So that's my take.
Well, and you bring up some good stuff and a great segue for where I see us going. And where do I see us going? Well, if it's not clear to you by now, the main imperative of the whole gig is growing. I don't care if you're an atom or whatever. Things are getting more complex. They're differentiating. They're semi-permeable, letting pieces of each other in. And here we are. It is very complex. So how do we sort it out? How do we find our higher values? I think Bob brought up something really good with the burqa. If you educate a woman in a burqa, the burqa eventually comes off. And that's a natural thing, that education happens. You can only keep people that isolated and that non-included if you keep them ignorant. And that's a huge piece where we can start to sort out a measure of the good. What is that? What are our higher values? How do we sort out and discern? Even in my own head, it is very difficult sometimes to discern stuff. It's so complex. It's easy to keep things in these big, broad strokes, but when you get down to reality, it's full of all these fine nuances. So next week, we're going to look about our higher values and the discernment process that allows us to uncover them. Till then, my friends, immerse yourself in the diversity, for there you will find the one. Blessings.